Hi guys and welcome back to the channel. Recently I had the chance to take this little very interesting RF 100 to 400mm lens into the field with me. And the question I asked myself, obviously, can a lens that feels a little bit plasticky, is this light, this small and doesn't cost that much, be any good? Let's find out, because the results most certainly surprised me. I couldn't even believe how light and small it is when I took it out of the box, and compared to the 100 to 500 it's just so much smaller, so much lighter. It's actually very fun to use in the field. It's quite a basic lens, obviously. It has a 67mm filter mount, just two basic buttons, stabilizer on and off, and a autofocus or manual focus button. It has the control ring that all RF lenses has a manual focusing ring, and it has our zoom ring. Being so basic is what makes this lens very attractive as well, because it's so light. It has a 1.2 meter minimum focusing distance on the long end. When it comes to the weight, this lens comes in at just 635 grams or 1.4 pounds, which also makes it super hand holdable. And with an R5, for instance, that I used with it with no battery grip, you have an amazing lightweight combo. So all in all, a very compelling package because it is so cheap. It's 4 times cheaper than this expensive 100 to 500mm lens. And I must say, when I took it out in the field on a pretty grey morning, it performed extremely well. The first thing that stood out to me was how stable the image stabilization was. In combination with the R5's IBIS, I could handhold video without problems. Part of that is obviously because it's so much lighter, so it's much easier to hold stable, but that image stabilization was definitely something really good. The autofocus also works pretty well, but definitely not as fast as some other lenses like this 100 to 500, for instance. I think this is one of the areas where you can definitely tell that it's a bit of a cheaper lens and it doesn't have the most high-end autofocusing motors. It could track birds pretty well, especially when they're more stationary. But when it comes to fast-moving objects or in video mode, for instance, I noticed a few delays where a bird would quickly look the other way, for instance, and it would take the autofocus a little while to actually reacquire focus. So while the autofocusing was very good overall, I could definitely tell that it's slower than some other RF lenses. One interesting aspect I noticed when filming is that if I don't half press the shutter button when filming, the image stabilization kind of starts to shake loose and it's kind of getting a bit wobbly. Whereas if I press the record button and then keep the shutter button half pressed, the footage stays very stable, and something similar I could sometimes see in photo mode as well. So if you're filming with this lens especially, half pressing the shutter button definitely gave me much more stable footage, which is a little bit odd, but that's definitely something that I found out in the field. Some of you might also wonder, can this lens take teleconverters? And yes, it can. And it also doesn't suffer from the same problem that the 100 to 500mm has, because with the 1.4 extender attached, for instance, this lens still maintains its full zoom range. This is something I really liked. However, you have to ask yourself, even if the image quality is alright, is this a lens that I would want to use extenders on? Because the extenders pretty much cost the same as the lens. This lens is wide open at a f5.6 at the shorter end and f8 at the 400mm end. So you're already f8 400mm. If you now use a 1.4 extender, you will actually now be at f11 wide open, and that will definitely be challenging in many situations. You will have to use high ISO, you probably have to deal with low shutter speeds. And if you are daring to use the 2x extenders, you would be wide open at 800mm and f16. So this is not really something you would want to be using, and you'd probably be better off buying an f11 800mm lens to have one longer lens, and then this 100 to 400mm lens is a more flexible zoom lens option. The biggest drawback of this RF 100 to 400mm lens is definitely how it renders the backgrounds. And this is also probably the biggest weakness for me with that lens, because it's almost impossible to get a nice and smooth background. You have to be super close to your subject, and even then the background has to be pretty far behind the bird to get any sort of smooth backgrounds. In most shots, the background is very visible, and compared to other lenses, this lens definitely doesn't dissolve the backgrounds as much, but you can't expect much of it at the same time because f8 at 400mm just gives you a lot of depth of field and a lot of visible background elements. So now I've talked up the lens so much with having a great price point, great weight, can take teleconverters. Let's look at some images and see if it can actually deliver when it comes to the image quality. If you're a photographer and you want to learn all about image editing, how I edit my images and how you can improve your image editing to really make your images stand out, then I would highly recommend that you check out my pro sets and my masterclass down there in the description. My pro sets will allow you to get to a great starting point with your raw files with just one click, and in my masterclass I teach you step by step all the important steps that you need to know to make your own images look fantastic. So if that's of interest to you, make sure to check that out down there in the description. So if we look at some of these examples, the image quality is almost shockingly good considering how cheap this lens is. Wide open, high ISO, handheld, and we're still getting some pretty good sharpness and details. I was actually quite impressed the first few times when I zoomed in on the back of the camera because I expected to be much worse than what I was actually getting. Here we also have an example where the curl you let me get super close and I put the 1.4 extender on, was shooting wide open at f11, still relatively high ISO, handheld, and again the image quality actually held up reasonably well. Considering this is a pretty cheap lens with a 1.4 teleconverter wide open, I think the image quality is still very, very good. Now all these shots that really stood out in terms of sharpness and smooth backgrounds were obviously taken with the bird really close to me. The further the bird went away from me, the more image quality and the background suffered for sure. So at larger distances, the image quality difference to bigger, better, more expensive lenses will probably show more. What do you think? Is that what you expected from this lens? Let me know in the comments. I also took this lens to another spot, kind of darkish conditions, and I tried to get pretty close to the birds again because whenever I wasn't close to the birds, the background just wouldn't dissolve it. On this galah, for instance, shot at around 300mm, you can see that the background isn't really dissolved at all and it just doesn't look super pleasant. But when I got much closer and zoomed in all the way to 400mm just trying to get a headshot, we got some nice image quality again and overall some pretty fantastic images. For most purposes, this lens is truly amazing because it's just so small and lightweight, and at that relatively little cost, it's almost a no-brainer for someone who doesn't want to spend much and have a nice versatile lens with them in the bag. Would I buy this lens myself? Probably not, because I have the 100 to 500mm lens, but someone, for instance, who has an 11 600mm lens and is looking for another lighter zoom lens that can give him a bit more flexibility on the wide end, this lens could be a great choice. So all in all, the 100 to 400 is a fun little lens at a great price point with great image stabilization and surprisingly good image quality and autofocus. Have you used that lens? Are you looking at it? Or let me know in the comments. Also make sure to give me a thumbs up for this video and subscribe to the channel, and I will see you very soon in another video. Bye guys.